The aggressors must get out of Afghanistan. Enver Hoxha, 1980. From Enver Hoxha Selected Works, Volume 5. Article published in the newspapers Ari Populit. The military occupation of Afghanistan, which was accomplished in recent days by the social imperialist Soviet Union, has aroused great anger among the progressive and freedom-loving peoples of the whole world. The Soviet intervention is blatant aggression not only against Afghanistan, but also against the neighboring peoples, against all the peoples of the Middle East zone, and against international peace and security. This is a fascist-type aggression like the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1968, a new edition of it, both from the standpoint of the military action and from the standpoint of the arguments used to justify it. The Soviet social imperialists are trying to present the occupation of Afghanistan as a lawful act carried out allegedly on the basis of the Afghan government's request for assistance and the Treaty of Friendship which exists between the two countries to protect Afghanistan from external interference, and so on. All these arguments are as stale as they are time-worn. They have been used by all aggressors at all times. The reality is that the Soviet social imperialists had carefully prepared the terrain for this occupation in advance, by interfering and disturbing the situation within the country in their own favor and by binding Afghanistan with the chains of enslaving treaties which the Soviet social imperialists use openly as instruments to occupy other countries or to keep these peoples dependent and under their control. The overthrow of the monarchy and subsequently of Daoud was a cynical exploitation by the rulers of Moscow of the liberation desires of the Afghan people, who suffered under the heavy burden of the oppression and exploitation by the monarchy and feudalism and their Soviet allies, and who wanted to see their country free and sovereign. In order to conceal their imperialist aims and to achieve them as quickly as possible, the staffs of the Kremlin interfered brutally in Afghanistan, bringing to power their own men whom they beheaded, one after the other, in their efforts to find the most suitable and the most obedient to Moscow. The Soviet Union is not interested in the freedom and independence of Afghanistan, as it claims, or in the liberation of the long-suffering people of that country. What interests it above all is the strategic position of Afghanistan in the Middle East, its closeness to the sources of oil, its key position in an extensive zone in which there is savage rivalry between the superpowers. The occupation of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union was carried out at the time when the United States of America is engaged in wide-ranging activity to exert pressure and blackmail against Iran, when it has undertaken real economic and political aggression against that country, accompanied by the demonstration of its strength and threats of military intervention. From this standpoint, the events in Iran and Afghanistan are closely linked and may be followed by other events of this kind in that region. They show how fiercely the rivalry between the United States of America and the Soviet Union for hegemony in the oil-rich region of the Middle East and in the Indian Ocean is raging, and what great dangers the superpowers present for the peoples of those regions. The aim of the superpowers is to attack and suppress the revolutionary movements of the peoples, to prevent their breaking free from the hegemony of imperialism and social imperialism, and to stop the peoples from setting out on the course of independent, democratic national development. The barbarous aggression of the Soviet social imperialists against Afghanistan, the continual threats of aggression on the part of the American imperialists, and the intrigues of the Chinese social imperialists in those regions, are fraught with great dangers for peace and security in the world. These activities refute all that great demagogic clamor which the superpowers make about the alleged preservation of peace and stability, the maneuvers in which they engage to blunt the vigilance of the peoples and countries that are threatened by their hegemonic and expansionist policies. The events in Iran and Afghanistan prove that precisely at the time when the imperialist and social imperialist superpowers are calling for peace, reduction of tension, disarmament, etc., they are preparing acts of aggression against the freedom and independence of the peoples. The occupation of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union is a product of its expansionist and aggressive strategy. It demonstrates quite clearly once again that aggression and the use of military force is the most prominent feature of Soviet foreign policy today. In its rivalry with American imperialism, Soviet social imperialism has been striving with might and main to secure new strategic positions and to extend the sphere of its control and domination in Asia, Africa, Latin America and everywhere else. In these efforts the Soviets do not hesitate to use any means, from diplomatic political maneuvers to military violence. Nevertheless, when the peoples take their fate, the defense of their just cause, into their own hands and rise in revolution, as they did in Iran, the superpowers suffer grave and irreparable defeats for their hegemonic positions. Having occupied Afghanistan and placed it under the iron heel of their military forces, the Soviet social imperialist aggressors are now trying to placate public opinion by claiming that they have dispatched only a few contingents which will stay there temporarily, only as long as necessary. But in fact they will stay there indefinitely. They will act in Afghanistan as they did in Czechoslovakia where, even today, 12 years later, their occupation troops are still stationed. Whatever promises and justifications the Soviet social imperialists may employ, they cannot cover up the grave crime which they have committed against the freedom, independence and national sovereignty of Afghanistan. No one, under any pretext, has the right to interfere in the internal affairs and life of other peoples and nations. The peoples alone are all-powerful and have the right to decide for themselves about their internal problems without any foreign interference. On the other hand, the hypocritical demagoguery of the American imperialists and Chinese social imperialists who are trying to present themselves as defenders of Afghanistan and shedding crocodile tears over its fate, can deceive no one. The American imperialists are trying to take advantage of these troubled situations for their own benefit, to justify their threats of military measures against Iran and other countries of the Middle East. The peoples do not forget the criminal war of the American imperialists in Indochina and elsewhere. Do not forget the criminal fascist-type aggression of the Chinese social imperialists against Vietnam, just as they can never forget Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan and so on. It is clear to them that the American imperialists, the Soviet social imperialists, the Chinese social imperialists and all other imperialists and reactionaries are equally bloodthirsty aggressors, mortal enemies of the freedom and independence of the peoples, and that they make deals and agreements between themselves to the detriment of the peoples. The events in Afghanistan and Iran, which affect the whole world, make it essential that the peoples enhance their vigilance against the aggressive activities of imperialism and social imperialism and unite in struggle against the aggressive, expansionist and hegemonic policy of superpowers. Now the freedom fighters of Afghanistan have taken up arms and are fighting courageously in the mountains and in the cities against the domination of the Soviets and their agents. Everywhere they are displaying exemplary bravery and proving their determination to keep the banner of freedom and national sovereignty flying and to fight to the end to drive out the occupiers. In this just and lawful struggle they have and will continue to have the support of all the freedom-loving peoples and honest and progressive persons everywhere in the world. The Iranian Revolution and the Iranian people are providing powerful support for their struggle. The Afghan fighters will certainly be supported by all the freedom-loving Muslim peoples wherever they are. In particular, the Arab and African peoples, who at present are under greater threat from the American imperialists and Soviet social imperialists, must rise and strongly express their fighting solidarity with the Iranian Revolution and the Afghan uprising, because in this way they will be fighting for their own freedom, independence and sovereignty. In these situations through the stands they adopt the leaders of those countries who truly defend the national interests and the interests of their peoples, will be distinguished from those who sell them out to foreigners. The Arab peoples, who live in a zone rich in oil, but who are poor, oppressed and exploited, see clearly the atrocities which the imperialists and neo-colonialists are committing against them. But we are convinced that the revolt which has begun in those countries will never be quelled. The modern weapons which the enemies may employ, even the most sophisticated ones, cannot operate without the oil which belongs to peoples who are fighting for freedom and independence. The Albanian people express their profound conviction that the valiant Afghan people will deal the Soviet social imperialist aggressors crushing blows and drive them from their country.